Right, hands up. Who sat in the language class had absolutely no idea what was going on, but could maybe recite a grammar table perfectly? You knew the rule, but you just couldn't really use the language. That is actually the grammar translation method in a nutshell. And today we're going to unpack exactly why that happened and what it means for us as teachers. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is grammar translation as a method? So, at its core, it's an approach to language teaching that focuses on two things: the detailed study of grammar rules and the use of translation as a main vehicle for learning. It's grammar and translation at its core. The method was dominant in European language classrooms from the 1840s all the way through until about the 1940s, and in modified forms, it continues to be used in parts of the world today. So before we dismiss it, we really need to understand it, because chances are, whether you are a teacher or a learner, this method has touched your life in some way. Let's think about its origins then and its connections to Latin. So, for centuries, Latin was the dominant lingua franca of international scholarship and cultural exchange all across the Western world. Renaissance scholars corresponded in Latin. It was the language of education, the language of the church, and also the language of the learned in society. Only from the 17th century onwards did Latin slowly decline as a living lingua franca, and the word living is really important. But even as Latin stopped being used for everyday communication, it retained an enormous status in education. It came to be seen as a kind of mental discipline, so a rigorous, systematic study considered essential preparation for all forms of higher education. Let's think about the grammar school in Britain. And why were they called grammar schools? Well, they were actually called grammar schools because they taught Latin grammar, not because they taught English grammar. So when modern languages like French and German were introduced into European school curricula in the 18th century, educators did what seemed completely logical at the time. They used the exact same approach they had been using for Latin. The textbooks were the same, so they had grammar rules, vocabulary, sentences for translation. Okay, let's get into the detail. What are the defining characteristics of the grammar translation method? Let's start with purpose. So the goal was to learn a language in order to read its literature or to gain the intellectual discipline that comes from mastering its grammar. Next is communication. And if you were a student in a grammar translation classroom, you were reading text and producing translations, and that was largely it. Grammar was taught deductively. So deductively means that the rule comes first and the practice comes second. The teacher presented the rule, explained it, gave examples, and students applied it through translation exercises. A typical lesson had three components. So this was the grammar rule, a vocabulary list with translation, and then also some translation tasks as well. And then really it was rinse and repeat after that. So the most important part of grammar translation was always the sentence. The sentence was kind of like the star of the show. One of the most distinctive features of this method is that the sentence was treated as the primary unit of teaching and practice. So the entire lessons were devoted to translating sentences into and out of the target language. So sentences carefully constructed to illustrate specific grammar points, but often with very little connection to real life communication. But think about any language learning or teaching that you're doing at the moment. Think about any apps that you might use. Quite often the sentences are grammatically useless, and some of this probably comes from a grammar translation tradition in some way. Let's think then about vocabulary and the use of the mother tongue as a medium of instruction. So vocabulary was learned through bilingual word lists, so target language words alongside their mother tongue translations. And these were drawn from whatever texts were being studied. So there was no context, there was no real world use, just lists. And crucially, everything was conducted in the student's native language. The mother tongue was the medium of instruction. So this was used to explain grammar, check understanding, and make comparisons between the two languages. The target language was a subject to be studied, not a medium to be used in itself. Now, here is where it gets kind of interesting, because by the mid-19th century, people started pushing back against the method and doing this quite seriously. The criticism was fairly straightforward. Students couldn't actually use the language. They could recite grammar rules, they could produce a technically accurate translation, but face to face with a native speaker, very often they just kind of panicked. For many students, this method created a genuinely tedious experience of memorizing endless lists of grammar rules and vocabulary and attempting to produce perfect translations of stilted literary prose. And it's, at its worst, it was remembered with real disdain by generations of school learners. And think about it yourself when you've been in the classroom and you're just learning and trying to memorize lists. It's just not any fun. And it's helpful to some extent, but how helpful is it? And from a broader perspective on language teaching, one that places communication at the center of why people learn languages, a method that doesn't prepare learners for real world use is by definition misaligned with those needs. Let's think then about why, if it was so problematic, why did grammar translation stick around for so long? And why does it still appear in some classrooms today? Well, there are a few honest reasons, and as teachers, it is worth sitting with these. It makes few demands on the teacher, especially those whose own spoken proficiency in the target language might be limited. It is what many teachers themselves experience, and familiarity is kind of powerful, isn't it? And we tend to teach the way we were taught, especially if we haven't had extensive training. The method gives teachers a sense of control and authority in the classroom. It works in large classes, so translation exercises are easy to set up and straightforward to manage. And in contexts where reading literary text is the primary goal, it can still be really fit for purpose and really useful. So what does this mean for your ELT practice as a professional? First, it's a reminder that every method is a product of its historical context. Grammar translation served a world where reading was the primary goal and where few people needed to communicate across languages in real time. If you think all the way back to when it was first used, people didn't really travel, so you were never going to speak to the native speaker of that language. Our learners' needs look very different now. Second, even if we have largely moved beyond grammar translation, its influence is still visible. We can see in textbooks that lead with grammar rules, in correction-heavy classrooms, in assessments that reward accuracy over communication, and also in language learning apps. Think about a language learning app that you might be using at the moment. Is there lots of grammar translation in it? Are you being asked to translate absolutely absurd sentences which make no sense and that you will never use? Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, grammar translation challenges us to ask, are we making conscious, principled choices about our methodology? Or are we doing things because this is how they've always been done? That, I think, is one of the most important or most useful questions that we can ask ourselves in our classrooms today. Okay, so that is a wrap on grammar translation explained with Micky and Ide. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, perhaps you can drop a comment below. Have you experienced grammar translation as a learner or as a teacher? We genuinely want to hear from you. And if you know someone working through an ELT qualification, perhaps do share this with them. It might just save them a little bit of time. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.